Decorated British Army officer and experienced polar explorer Henry Worsley perished in 2016 in a hospital in Punta Arenas, Chile, after attempting a daring solo trek across the frozen continent of Antarctica. But to understand why Worsley did what he did, you first need to know the legend of his personal hero, Ernest Shackleton, and Shackleton's own ill-fated Antarctic journey. So, today we're looking back at the doomed Antarctic expedition of Henry Worsley. But before we get started, make sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. Then plant your Explorer flags in the comments and let us know what other famous or infamous expeditions you would like to hear about next. Okay, everyone use the bathroom before we leave, because the next stop is, nowhere. As most U.S. history students learn in high school, if they're paying attention in class, the traditional European age of exploration started in the 1400s and continued through the 17th century. Columbus did sail the ocean blue in 1492, after all, but these sailors were seeking lucrative new trade routes and colonies to establish and lands to exploit, so they didn't venture frequently to the planet's inhospitable extreme south. The prevailing belief among geographers was that the Arctic Circle would naturally be balanced by a similar continent in the south. But the notion of a vast continent running along the southernmost portion of the Earth, sometimes referred to as Terra Australis, was purely hypothetical. During his first voyage in the early 1770s, British explorer James Cook sailed around New Zealand, mapping much of the Australian coastline in the process. He proved to the folks back home that both of these landmasses were islands and not extensions of a larger southern continent. Cook's next expedition, spanning 1772 to 1775, crisscrossed temperate zones of the southern Pacific Ocean, searching for Terra Australis, but finding only small islands instead. Cook's crew were the first Europeans to visit spots like Easter Island, Tahiti, the Tonga Island, New Caledonia, the Southern Sandwich Islands, and South Georgia, and he gave many of these locales their present-day names. Cook's voyage was also the first European expedition in history to cross the Antarctic Circle. But rather than fueling interest in Antarctic exploration, Cook's journey brought it to a screeching halt. The notion that any Antarctic continent would be covered in ice, and thus uninhabitable and of no clear economic use, made fundraising for further expeditions nearly impossible. Over the first half of the 19th century, there was a brief revival of interest in Antarctic exploration, as a number of sealing and whaling ships had started venturing further and further south over the years. In 1839, voyages by British naval officer James Clark Ross on the warships HMS Erebus and HMS Terror confirmed the existence of the Antarctic continent, made a number of biological and botanical discoveries, and named what's still referred to as the Ross Ice Shelf. Nonetheless, upon his return to civilization, Ross concluded that there were no further scientific discoveries to be found in the entirety of Antarctica. These same two vessels, the Erebus and the Terror, were also used for Sir John Franklin's failed Arctic expedition in 1845. The entire crew of both ships, including Franklin himself, perished as the ships remained icebound in northern Canada's Victoria Strait for over a year. And if you saw the AMC show, there may or may not have been a monster involved. Either way, Ross's declaration and Franklin's misfortune once again torpedoed interest in exploring Antarctica. Though technological and scientific advancements made the world somewhat easier than it would have been during the original age of exploration, trekking across the Antarctic was still no easy feat at the turn of the 20th century. Arguably, the principal figure of this period was Anglo-Irish explorer Ernest Shackleton. From 1901 through 1904, Shackleton served on the Discovery Expedition, which studied the continent's biology, zoology, geology, and meteorology, and confirmed the existence of snow-free Antarctic valleys. Leading the Nimrod expedition of 1907 to 1909, that's Nimrod, the converted whaling ship, not the X-Men villain, Shackleton and three companions got just 97 geographical miles away from the South Pole, setting a new record for the furthest recorded journey south to date, before turning around due to weather and limited supplies. The European race to the South Pole ended on December 14, 1911, when Norwegian Roar Amundsen and his crew of 4 reached the legendarily remote spot on the map. Shackleton and his compatriots then revised their goals and started prepping what they termed the Imperial Transantarctic Expedition, aiming to make the first ever land crossing of the entire continent. The plan was for a group including Shackleton to sail on board the Endurance through the Weddell Sea and into the Vassal Bay, where 6 of them would disembark and start the journey across land along with 69 dogs, 2 motor sledges, and provisions. Another party would sail to the opposite side of the continent on board the Aurora via the Ross Sea and set up a base at McMurdo Sound. The 2 groups would then meet up at Beardmore Glacier, make observations, and assist one another back to the base. It was the pincer maneuver of exploration. Endurance left Plymouth, England in August of 1914, reached a whaling station on South Georgia Island by the 5th of December, and then set out for Antarctica. But continuing through the ice was extremely slow-going and painstaking, and by February of 1915, Endurance was completely trapped in the Weddell Sea. The ship itself started to splinter and break in the powerful ice by the close of the winter months, forcing the crew to start camping on the ice itself. On November 21st, Endurance slipped entirely beneath the ice. The wreckage wasn't recovered until March of 2022, over 100 years later. Shackleton actually survived the ordeal, and after making it back to civilization, he returned to Elephant Island in a steamship to rescue crew members that had been left behind. Even though the expedition was a failure, Shackleton himself is still regarded as a hero for his leadership and resolve. Although, maybe next time, start with the steamship. British Army officer Lieutenant Colonel Alastair Edward Henry Worsley. Worsley served in the British Army for 36 years, including command roles in Afghanistan, Northern Ireland, Bosnia, and Kosovo. He was appointed a member of the Order of the British Empire in 1993 for his distinguished service in Ireland. A distant descendant of Shackleton's skipper from the Endurance, Frank Worsley, Henry had always been inspired by his ancestors' incomplete voyage. In 2008, Worsley made his first trip to Antarctica, commemorating the 100th anniversary of Shackleton's Nimrod expedition. Worsley and his team traced Shackleton's route through the Transantarctic Mountains and across the Beardmore Glacier. But unlike their predecessors, who had to turn around just 97 miles from their destination, Worsley's team completed the full journey to the pole. Take that, Great Uncle Frank. In 2011, Worsley returned to Antarctica once again as part of a 6-person expeditionary team. The team retraced Norwegian Roald Amundsen's route from 100 years earlier, making Worsley the first European explorer to reach the pole. Following these 2 successful excursions, Worsley felt ready to make his grandest expedition to date, not just realizing his hero Shackleton's dreams, but to one-up the famed explorer. In 2015, he set out to make the first ever solo, unaided Antarctic crossing. In 1997, Norwegian explorer Børge Ausland became the first person to traverse the entire Antarctic continent by himself. But he made the journey with the use of a powerful kite that helped to pull both himself and his 330-pound sledge. In 2012, British explorer Felicity Aston also successfully completed a trek across Antarctica, but with the use of supply drops along the route, rather than pulling all of her own supplies. By contrast, Worsley planned to do it all the hard way, as Shackleton would have had to do a century before. Although, to be honest, Shackleton was probably dreaming about kites and supply drops at the time he was eating his sled dogs. Worsley carried everything he needed along with him on foot, and physically pulled the sled containing his shelter, food, and equipment on his own power for the entire journey. The excursion was promoted and backed in part by Prince William, the Duke of Cambridge. Together, he and Worsley used the publicity around the stunt to raise money for the Endeavour Fund, a charitable organization that arranges programs and adventures for injured veterans. The expedition raised over $150,000, which more than doubled after it culminated in tragedy. In November of 2015, Worsley set out from Berkner Island in the northwestern portion of Antarctica. The goal was to spend 75 days crossing the continent on a 900-mile route, taking him over the South Pole and culminating not far from the Beardmore Glacier on the Ross Ice Shelf. While pulling his sled, which weighed around 300 pounds, Worsley started out walking around 13 hours per day. As he traveled, he kept a diligent audio diary, which gives us deeper insight into his experiences. 51 days into his journey, Worsley reached the South Pole and the Amundsen Scott South Pole Research Station. As there are researchers who live and work at the station, Worsley had the option of stopping off for supplies, or just to see a friendly human face or two. But he was committed to the concept of a truly solo journey, so he didn't stock up on anything. Just hauling a 300-pound sled across the icy frozen tundra would be challenging enough, but Worsley faced a number of other obstacles along his route. As his journey progressed, Antarctica experienced some unseasonably cold temperatures. Around the time he reached the South Pole, Worsley was recording temperatures of minus 47 degrees Fahrenheit, accompanied by 40 to 50-mile-an-hour winds. This made the initially firm and level snow under his feet softer and more difficult to navigate. Worsley's journey also took him across some areas of Antarctica with high elevations and regions that are pockmarked with dangerous deep crevasses that are nearly impossible to see through wind and snow. Some parts of the Transantarctic Mountains that Worsley was crossing reached 9,700 feet in elevation, where the wrong step over a lightly snow-covered crevasse can end an entire expedition in a heartbeat. While Worsley managed to avoid making the wrong step and plunging down a frozen mountain, his journey was ultimately cut short by dehydration, hunger, exhaustion, and illness. And there was no possible way he could have possibly replaced the 10,000 calories he was going to burn per day hauling that sled around. Worsley had calculated that he'd lose around 28 pounds just due to the physical strain of making the trip. But it seems he'd still underestimated the impact that exhaustion and fatigue would have on him by this point in the journey. Making the situation even more complicated, most of the food Worsley brought with him quickly became frozen and difficult to consume. At one point, he broke a tooth on a frozen snack bar. He had brought enough food for 80 days, 5 days more than he'd estimated the journey to take. But nonetheless, his diaries contain numerous mentions of hunger and a strong desire to resume eating normal foods. By the 70th day of his journey, less than 30 miles from his goal, Worsley became so exhausted he was unable to continue. After spending 2 straight days recovering in his tent, pinned down by a massive storm, he radioed for help from his team and was airlifted to a hospital in Punta Arenas, Chile. There, doctors discovered that he was suffering from bacterial peritonitis, a severe inflammation of the abdomen and abdominal organs. While undergoing a surgical procedure in Chile on January 24th of 2016, Worsley succumbed to organ failure at the age of 55. Like his hero Shackleton before him, Worsley went on to become a celebrated and inspirational figure in British culture, and he received posthumous tributes from members of the British Antarctic Survey, Prince William, and international football star David Beckham. Even Shackleton would have been impressed with that. So what do you think? Would you ever try to cross Antarctica on foot? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.